This isn't your typical motorsports podcast. You're listening to Crush This, a monster truck podcast presented by High Octane Coffee and J Concepts. A show where we take you inside the minds of your favorite drivers, past and present, of the monster truck industry. And now, your hosts, Brad Shaw and Dan Chichagash. Buckle in. The show starts now.
Hey guys, welcome. That's our little intro there, Marty. None other than Mr. Overkill himself, Marty Garza. How you doing today, sir?
Very good. How you doing, Cheech?
Oh, hang in there, getting ready for a insane Monster Jam season, getting ready to do all that stuff with the Hall brothers and get the ball rolling here.
Yeah, I wish I could say the same. We're a little bit hampered this year due to the COVID restrictions and all. And so Mikey, I'm sure a lot of people have questions. Where's Mikey? Some of you might know he's married to, his wife is from Canada. She's a nurse up there and they live in Canada. So he's been working on his dual citizenship for a while now. And as a result of that, he can't travel. So that really put a real damper on what we could do as far as touring. But he's almost done. So hopefully he'll be back within the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, this COVID really took a chip off of everyone's block, you may say, but as long as we're getting the ball rolling, the ball is rolling, and if everyone be safe and everything like that, it's we'll get the ball, like I said, we'll get the ball rolling,
Yeah. Oh, just want things to get back to normal.
Yeah, correct. But in this episode, man, there's a lot of things to talk about in this book here, Marty. I looked through it, read it, some awesome stories and stuff like that we'll go through. But let's start from ground zero. And the day that, remember the day that, kind of lit the fire to get this book pushed. Can you tell the story about how this came all about?
Yeah, it's kind of in the introduction of the book, but just to give a brief overview of how this happened. At World Finals, so some of you might know, in the back, there's the whole city that goes on behind the scenes, where there's so many trucks, so many drivers, and everything. We have big tents set up for our catering and all. And one day we were sitting at catering, sitting at a table with a bunch of drivers, some current drivers, and we were talking about, I guess Mike was there and everything, so we were kind of talking about the old days, old Panda days and stuff. And I could tell by the look on the face of a couple of the new, younger drivers, they had no idea what we were talking about. And just the question came up, do you know who Bob Chandler is? And I was shocked that one of these well-known current drivers had no idea who he was. And I was just, you're joking, right? And he was totally serious. And I tell you, that stuck with me, because I was like, how is that even possible? I mean, I guess it's weird because I'm from the old school, so I just assume that people know a lot of these things that we just take for granted, right? Well, it struck me that we were losing our history, and then there's a lot of revisionist history, without getting into too much detail. There's a lot of revisionist history out there, and it bothered me. And this went on for a little while. And then one day, this was maybe a couple of months later or something, I get a phone call from a publishing company asking if I would be interested in writing a book. And I said, well, what's the topic? What specifically do you want? And they said, it's up to you. We just want you to write a book. We're not telling you what to write. You just write what you feel is important. And I'm like, okay, this is an opportunity to do something about this, revisionist history or this lost this potential loss of our history. I said, if somebody needs to document this before it's too late, we're not all going to be around forever. And a lot of these stories are just word of mouth type things that, we were there, things that happened, and the way certain technologies came about. Modern day fans kind of just almost like assume it's always been that way, or that the way things are done now just like spontaneously appeared from one day to the next. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth, as you know. So I decided this book was going to be a detailed history of how the monster trucks began to what you see today. So I guess that's a little bit of a misconception. Some people might get the impression that the book is completely about the past, and it's not. It actually covers up to current technologies. Mm-hmm. But in order to explain that, I felt like I almost had to explain where the technologies originated, since early monster trucks, and you know this because you've read it, but early monster trucks were comprised of repurposed equipment. Everything, there was no such thing as a monster truck specific component. So everything on a monster truck came from something else. Well, I found it instructive to be able to provide the reader with some background as to why those technologies were developed in the first place, in order to give you a better understanding of why they were used in a monster truck application. And I think it gives you a better appreciation of subtle things that you don't really, the average person may not even put thought into, like something like as simple as a U-joint or a differential or something like that. So, there's a lot of detail in the book, as you know.
Yeah, like for example, your first chapter is tires. You went full back on the purpose of the circular motion of a tire, then talked about how a tire itself was created. And that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that I felt that was, again, things that we seemingly take for granted, like the Terra tire, the monster truck, what we recognize as a monster truck tire. I felt it was really important to give people an understanding of how they came to be, because again, those were not, flotation tires didn't exist prior to the late 60s. And I thought the story of how they came to be developed, it's such an off the wall, most unlikely thing you could ever imagine that leads to the development. Without, I guess I won't give necessarily any spoilers, but for those people that have read the book, you understand that fishing in Alaska, I'm talking like the natives, ancient natives from Alaska have a direct connection to the tires that are on a monster truck right now. You're like, how can fishing and a monster truck have anything in common? Well, the story of how that development came about I thought it was an amazing story and worth telling.
Right. And we'll go through more and more of this book, but I got to take also a break of also talk about Scott Bryant. He also did a book about 15 years ago. It was like a medium-sized book, had all these photos and stuff like that. He did a book about that, but he helped out with this, and with Scott's help, I mean, I met him in person. Scott's a great guy, but with Scott here, what helped you out with this book?
Well, that's one of those, I guess, amazing synchronicities that happen that I talk about at the beginning of the book, is that it just, sometimes things just work out, and Scott and I have been friends for a long time. His book was the best monster truck book ever written, as far as I'm concerned. It was just very factual, and, Dave Huntoon did all the photography, which, another amazing guy. And so knowing Scott for this long, he's like, there's so much, detail and history in his head. He's maybe better at dates than I am. Like I have maybe the firsthand practical knowledge, but he has more of the analytical, data, like dates of when things might have come to be. And we spent, I tell you, the process behind this, it was quite a trip. This was like, you could almost write a book on the development of the book. And in fact, the notes, there were dozens and dozens of interviews that took place in order to make this possible. And it, over a course of like almost 4 years. So, and I actually have a book of handwritten notes. I mean, a complete book, like of all, the questions I would ask, only a fraction of which actually made it into the book. But there's a lot of detail, a lot of history. The book was already massive, so I had to leave some of the littler, smaller, less important stories out, but they're super interesting to me. So maybe one day there'll be a story on, book on all these anecdotes of monster truck history. But Scott and I would like scrutinize a certain thing. Like, there are a lot of like certain things that people take for granted, like a certain story or something that people just take as fact. And Scott and I would get this and analyze it. Like we would, if we had this like little doubt in our mind about, well, that's like one person's, perspective of a situation, but that's not necessarily representative of reality. So we would start doing research, and we'd start investigating these things, and through interviews. And very often interviews would have conflicting information, and so we would go through just massive numbers of pictures. I have a huge library of pictures of monster trucks, because I've always, since I was, even before I was in the industry, since their very early 80s, I would travel to events to take pictures of details and things like that. This is the way I do things. So we would compare things. I'll give you an example. So of things that seemed, in the grand scheme of things, it delayed things for almost no reason, but it was important to get these details right. There was a question about the development of driveline brakes. And I think that most people believed that Flying High was the first truck with driveline brakes. And we knew that wasn't true, but we couldn't quite pin it down to a date. So we started going through pictures, and a lot of these trucks would change from 1 week to the next. They weren't in the early days of monster trucks. Things were changing very rapidly, right?
Because everything's breaking.
Right. So we would, yeah, exactly. And that led to innovation. Well, we scrutinized pictures of specifically USA 1, for example, because Everett gave us his version of how he developed the driveline brake, right? But again, we didn't want to rely on just his version. We wanted to cross-reference this and to verify it. So we put together a chronology of pictures of changes of, we could tell when he was flipping his hubs in and, making minor changes to the truck. But we could tell from the pictures where he was inching his way towards the driveline brake. So we pinned it down to where we figured out between which shows it was that the driveline brakes got implemented. So we were able to definitively prove that this was the first monster with driveline brakes. And it was actually before Flying High. Just Flying High got notoriety because they were visible. They were on the front side of the axle, so you could see them. And Everett did it, Everett being a racer, he tried to keep everything secret. So he had them inboard and painted everything black. He didn't want anybody to know they were there because it gave him an advantage, So that's just an example of how Scott was integral in the development of this book.
Man, and like I said with this book too, for example, like you said with the driveline brakes, you guys also took with the chapter itself with the driveline and suspension and stuff like that. You also broke into different variables. So you talked about driveline brakes for a moment, but then you also mentioned about Bigfoot's wet brake system that he had on the ZF axles. You also talked about how like for instance, the axle system and stuff like that, the ZFs. You mentioned a story about how Fred in the early 90s got sponsored by ZF and came up with that axle story. And then when the Dapneys found out about the planetaries where a 20-ton Clark can fit on a military 5-ton axle housing, and that created that story. You also
completely by accident.
Right? Yeah.
Completely by accident. It was a mistake, and it led to one of probably the single biggest, innovation in monster truck history.
But you also broke it down too. You explained about Pettibones. You explained about Rockwells. You explained about also the stuff, excuse me, that was like a one-time deal. Someone experimented with the stuff. For instance, you even talked about joysticks instead of steering wheels. You talked about Kurt Dabney's Blue Thunder on how it was a joystick and the stuff like that. With the book itself, you went further in depth in smaller subjects than that is awesome. So detailed. It's great that you can have a subject and you can branch it off to different points.
Yeah, the logistics of how the book was going to be laid out took quite a bit of time to work out, and there were different versions. It's difficult because there's so much overlap between certain technologies, and I didn't want to have to be telling the same stories over and over, and I also didn't want to be jumping from, let's say, axle technology to chassis technology and things that would make it very confusing because, granted, this isn't the easiest book to read. Most people will read it 3 or 4 times to kind of, because you are not going to, there's no way to absorb all the information in the first reading. I couldn't do it. I wrote it, so
I'm going to read it again.
It takes a lot to digest it. And like an example of what you're talking about, the branches of how this kind of works out is you can take something as simple as steering, which again, the assumption is that monster trucks have always had hydraulic steering, which wasn't true. In fact, monster trucks were on 66s for a fair amount of time before they even converted over to hydraulic. And there were, in that transition phase, and this gets explained in detail in the book of how the first side-by-side race for That's Incredible, Everett, it's pretty well known. Everett ran into issues. He couldn't steer the truck because that was the first time they put the 66s on it, right? Literally the first time it ever moved was at the filming, and he couldn't steer it. So he had a hard time getting over the cars, keeping it going in a straight line. Well, that Everett was not going to take that and just rest on his laurels, right? He went and tried to figure out a better way. Well, Bob Chandler ran mechanical steering boxes, like F550, F650 mechanical steering boxes up until Bigfoot 3. He was running a mechanical steering for a long time, as well as many others. Skull Bandit and a lot of the other early monster trucks ran mechanical steering linkages, which was fine when you have very little suspension travel, but it made them hard to steer and all. And so when trucks started experimenting with hydraulic steering, you had Boss Hogg, you had of course Everett worked Orbital, and then the Dabneys had, like you were mentioning, that hydraulic on a joystick, which was a big advantage because he had a toggle. And that's another misconception, was that front and rear were controlled with a joystick. That wasn't true. It actually had a toggle because it was a joystick off of a helicopter, a Huey, 86 Huey, I think, helicopter. And the joystick at the top of the joystick, the little toggle, was how you could control the rear steer. So you could steer front and back with one hand simultaneously, but independently. And then with a short wheelbase, it gave him a big advantage. And so the hydraulic steering, and then, Everett got the idea to do the full hydraulic steering ram. And so there were different variations. So that's kind of extensively covered in the book as well.
So let's go with the first chapter of this book. I thought it was my favorite. The Black Rhino. A lot of people may think that in this book, like the first chapter, they thought maybe whoever hasn't read the book, assuming that the first chapter would be talk about Bigfoot, you know what I mean? Or, you know, the original monster trucks. Well, you didn't. You talked about a gentleman in California that had a street rod. He converted it to call it the Black Rhino. How did you hear about that story? And how did you get connected with the gentleman?
The Black Rhino is kind of a legend. And this is a gray area. The Rhino's awesome, right? It was revolutionary. It did things no one had ever done before. And it's in there as a setup for the last chapter. For me personally, as amazing as the Black Rhino is, it's arguably a monster truck. You can get different opinions from different people, and they're not going to necessarily agree on whether it was a monster truck or not. And I want to make a distinction here because I see this a lot. I see a lot of pictures online people post of old mail trucks and things like that with, airplane tires and stuff like that. That to me is not a monster truck. That is a street truck with big tires. That's like a lifted truck it would be today, maybe. That's not a monster truck. And you get into this real vague definition of what is a monster truck. Well, its intended use has a lot to do with that, in my opinion. And the Rhino was built for performance, right? So it's like on that edge. It uses a lot of the technologies that a monster truck uses, custom frame, custom axles, custom transfer case, big V8 engine, all these technologies. It was like right on the cusp of being what we would consider a monster truck. 48-inch tires in the front, 52-inch tire or 56-inch tires in the back. Amazing machine, amazing performance. The stories I hear about it, I have some video of it. Incredible. And the way it came about, really cool story. But that was in the book as a setup for what it inspired, which in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, was the first known, and that's distinction, known, because tomorrow something could appear that no one had ever heard of, right? Or seen. But in my opinion, the first thing that meets the criteria, that in my mind would be what a monster truck would be defined as, was the truck covered or the machine covered in the final chapter. Because it did things in 1964 that monster trucks weren't doing till like 1985 or so. In other words, not even early monster trucks were as advanced as that thing was. It had a lot of really cool, because it was built by people who were very gifted, and kids that were very gifted.
Right. And then like you reach around the chapters and stuff. Man, this is a lot of pages in this book. And it's so cool. I'm looking at it still. You talk about, like chapter 1, when, you talk about tires. I always go based off of chapter 1 because that's the first thing it talks about is what people see the most that recognize a monster truck. And you described a lot of the stories in the first chapter. You explained about, different experimental tires. Like I believe in the book, talk about like a giant beanbag tire. That rolled and stuff like that. And then throughout the chapter itself, you kind of also branched out different stories, like Jeff Dane and Everett Jasmer, then Bob Chandler. You're talking, meanwhile, in Texas, Jeff Dane is, finding military parts to build his, Ford F-250, 350 truck. And then out of nowhere, while you're reading, you say, meanwhile, or a different chapter, you talk about a couple guys from the Midwest of St. Louis, Jim Kramer and Bob Chandler, doing their thing. And then branch off to that, you talk about the guy from Minnesota. Like you said before, like the ties and the logistics of this book, for how much you had to do, the flow is really easy as a monster truck fan to pay attention what's going on with the book.
Yeah, and I think that was, one thing that I guess I wanted to make sure to illustrate, and it's stated, but beyond just stating it, I wanted to illustrate the fact that sometimes people will argue which truck was first and everything. And keep in mind, we're talking very short window of time, right? A lot of these things were happening almost simultaneously, but they were happening in remotely distant areas in a day that there was no, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have Facebook that you could see what was happening, what somebody was building. You wouldn't find out for months if you were lucky. And, and a magazine, would take 3-4 months before a picture would be published if they took something. The lead time. So these vehicles weren't being, as these early builders, Russ Gerhardt and Jeff Dane and Bob Chandler and Dan DeGrasse, they weren't copying each other. It just kind of made sense, as people got the idea to put these bigger tires. These were kind of the logical solutions. So, and again, there were probably a lot of trucks and a lot of things tested that we never have seen. These things, a lot of were regional, and we're always finding these regional trucks that are fairly impressive that no one really, knew too much about. Only us, geeks that really dig into this and search these things out, even ever will stumble across a small picture of something, or there'll be a truck in the background, and we're like, what is that? I've never seen that. Or it's an early version of a truck that came into existence later, or a predecessor to a truck that came later. There was a lot of that.
Man, and then what also mentioned, just some like Chris Foss's contributions, the photos. Some of these photos in this book is Marvel, from old pictures all the way to new. So, this, like, people don't get it twisted. This book isn't just about old stuff. It's all the way up to what we're racing today and the technology. Like for instance, like the photos that you talked about, different photos in general of, the axle housings, detailed photos of, the chassis, the center cradle. There's about a good 3 or 4 pages, heck, 6 pages or more of you showing pictures of cradle framing, of different cradles. Right. Low CG motors, all the way from, the V to a lot of the square rectangular cradles and stuff like that. And I don't know who all helped out, but gosh, the photos in this book is so detailed.
All the majority of those more technical photos were all mine. There's over 750 pictures and that's the edited version of there's about 750 pictures. I'd say more than half of them are my own, but I did have a lot of help. Chris provided me with some great pictures. Dave Huntoon, Bruce Browning. There were, a lot of, a lot of contributors. Even Jeff Dane, Bob Chandler, Everett. They all gave me a lot of good pictures. And I wanted to try to put in things no one had ever seen before, which is very, very hard now because everything gets, as soon as I've learned, my own pictures are everywhere on the internet, But I went to as great lengths as I could to post or to publish pictures that no one had ever seen. And especially in the first and last chapters, those are very protective of because there was so much work to dig up. That took months, years to find the people and, connections through connections to chase these people down and find all this information that, did not exist on the internet any period.
Right.
Like
it's even crazy. Mr. Jeff Lucky has photo. I'm even in this book. At the back, there's a photo with the MTRA, and it's Kurt flipped over with General Tire. I'm right there.
Yeah.
I noticed that one at the end of the book. I was like, hey, I'm in the book. And back my head, but it doesn't matter. It's still in the book. But
You were there.
Yeah. So also Jeff Lucky, he always takes some good photos also.
Yeah.
You also talk about some of the stories, like I said, which I was very impressed, was the snow. I had to look back a little bit. The snow train, the story of Bigfoot 5. You also went, which was, I thought was interesting for me, because when I read that part of the chapter and I was done, I don't know if this phone knows what I want to read or
Oh, yeah,
look.
it does.
But someone,
if you make a comment, it heard you.
Yeah, right. YouTube shows a video about the Alaskan snow train, about I forget I can't pronounce his name.
Letourneau.
Thank you, and his technology of the snow, the snow train itself, and prior to the snow train, they talked about the Arctic. Back in, I think, 1939, they created to venture off and take a look at all the vast wilderness of the Arctic, and they talked about the electric engines that hooked up to it, that turn it. Well, they were frustrated, I guess, and they abandoned it in the Arctic tundra. But that further information about it, how you put in this book, also laid way to how Bob found those tires in Seattle.
Right.
But still, you went in depth and talked about the history of those tires.
I know the documentary you're talking about that just came out recently.
Yes. Yeah.
I wish that had been out 4 years ago when I was writing the book, because, and the guy, interestingly, the guy in the book, in the documentary, mentions Bigfoot and shows it, and he talks that the stories are all the stories about it were all wrong. Well, mine wasn't wrong. I got the story accurate because it took a lot of work to dig up all that, and again, interviews with lots of different people to get the stories from the people who were there when it happened. And and Bob Chandler helped me with a lot of that too. One of the most surprising aspects of that, and let's not forget Mike Welch has a part in that too, because he had tires off of the snow. Oh boy, I can't remember the name of it.
The
Snow Cruiser, which had the 88-inch version of the tires, and so I wanted to make the distinction, and I wanted to show, because there was so much misconception about what specific vehicle those tires came off of. And as I got into that story and finding out more about it, I started learning more about R.G. Letourneau. And his story is so amazing, I had to put it in the book. It was one of the latter things that got added to the book. After I had already edited out a bunch of stuff, I go back and have to insert a lot of information on Letourneau because I was so impressed by him. And honestly, I didn't even begin to do him justice. There's quite a bit on him, but the guy was amazing, and he deserves a lot of credit. I don't want to spoil it, but there wouldn't be monster. For all intents and purposes, there wouldn't be such a thing as a monster truck if it was not for R.G. Letourneau. And I'm not talking about the 10-foot tires. It's something completely different. That guy was extraordinarily gifted.
Right. Because also further detailed for him also, I'm branching out just a little bit from the book. He was using he did a lot of stuff for agricultural and construction. I know a lot of the main focus was the electric engine to each drive line. So each wheel had its own
the planetaries.
engine. Yeah, the planetaries
had electric motors inside them. Yeah. He invented the the motor grader that we know today. He had over 200 patents to his name. So a lot of the heavy equipment we know of today was invented by R.G. Letourneau.
Right, right. And that's some of the cool side stories that you created in this book that helps people understand what, where we come from. For like we talked about the axles and the chassis and stuff. I mean, you go from before, I guess, Gen 1s all the way to today's chassis talks about chassis. You had a pretty good story in this book about Tom Meents on the Paraglide. That's that's about a good 5 pages about Meents in the Paraglide story.
Yeah, that I put that in there because I don't think people realize how significant that innovation was. Even as we started addressing the weak points, there's always weak points in a monster truck. Nothing is ever infallible, right? But as we implemented better suspensions and better axles and planetaries and started improving all these things, the one area that we could not, it seemed as though that was the barrier. The thing we could not get past was transmissions. And the automatic transmission was the Achilles heel of the monster truck for a couple of decades. And throughout the Penda days, even prior to that, it was just normal. Transmissions and monster trucks don't mix, right? So, and I go into explaining how, there were attempts to address it by other means, Equalizer using the B&J and, Fred implementing the Lenco, and, of course, Hall Brothers use a Lenco, and so this persisted until, it was out of necessity, right? Tom had this very successful mud racer with, crazy horsepower and didn't have transmission problems. And he's like, well, why wouldn't it work? And he was, people were skeptical about the idea of running a 2-speed transmission in a monster truck. Honestly, Extreme Overkill was going to have a B&J 2-speed in it because I was trying to shorten up everything. It was designed for a B&J, and then we ended up using a C6 because there was enough experimental stuff on it as it was. But I thought the idea of a 2-speed made sense because I know, when I was driving, I was banging second within half a second of nailing off the line. I didn't well, why not just alter the gearing and just skip the shift? So when the day came that Tom had a transmission failure and he didn't have a spare, and he looks over and he's got his mud car there, he's like, well, hell, let's stick that thing in there and see how it works. And nobody believed it was going to work. And it worked very, very well. And it wasn't long before all of a sudden the ball got rolling, and we never looked back. There's no and now we were lucky if we ran, I'll tell you, on Maximum Overkill, I was lucky if I went 2 weeks on a transmission. I was thrilled if I got through a show and didn't have to change the transmission after. I was thrilled. We go 6-8 months, depending on how you use it, you might go a whole season without changing a transmission now. That didn't just spontaneously happen. With monster trucks weren't like that, you know what I mean? And I felt it was important to give Tom credit for being astute enough to notice this opportunity, right? And taking advantage of it and making it work. And there were alterations that had to be made to make them work, right? But nevertheless, that led to a huge improvement in reliability of the trucks themselves and improvement in their performance.
Right. That and then I also noticed you did little different chapters. For instance, on technology wise, you gave credit to Dave Cook and Jack Woolman. Also Gary Cook. Just those chapters within a chapter that express the turning points of, obviously you talked about Bigfoot 8. You have a good topic of your own. You have a lot of information of your past in this book also, from your very first Overkill all the way to Evo. So I mean that also, let's talk about you, Marty. Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about,
nobody wants to hear that.
you have a lot of influence in this book with all the chassis that you talk about. And what got you to express a lot more, not a lot more, but also, I guess sometimes some authors like to push back of what they want to tell their stories, but you brought a lot of stories of yourself in this book. And what got you to, I know you're an innovator also, so I can't really hide the fact on that. But I mean, you talked a lot about your trucks in this book too.
Yeah, but I have to give credit where credit's due, and I wouldn't none of my contributions would ever have happened if it weren't for the guys you just mentioned. Bob Chandler, Gary Cook, Jack Willman, Fred Schaefer. Those guys, those were the innovators, right? They were the guys taking the chances. A lot of us, including myself, benefited greatly. In other words, we had a big head start. We didn't start from the ground, right? A lot of this stuff had kind of been proven, which for me allowed me to take advantage of the things we knew already worked and then experiment with the specific areas that could use maybe some improvement. So, the whole story of the development, to me, that era with, Equalizer, Taurus 3, and Bigfoot 8, that was like the glory days of monster trucks, right? That was this huge jump in technology. All of a sudden, they became a monster truck, a purpose-built machine, not a street truck that evolved into a performance, exhibition type vehicle. These machines were purposely designed to race in a specific environment, and so those were the groundbreaking machines that led to all these things that happened later.
So let's go to that golden age, because another person that you mentioned in this book, and a lot of, which I think if people don't recognize or read this book to find out about him, was I learned a lot about Gary Porter.
Yeah.
The way you described, and I didn't know. I'm sorry, I'm not a huge Gravedigger fan. I like Gravedigger, but I didn't know he built Dennis's Gravedigger 3. He took part in the technology of
chassis, anyway.
The chassis. I mean, the chassis of Gravedigger 3. Him using the technology of, instead of nitrogen shocks on the cantilever system, he used a Custer's coilover spring, as the adjustments for the coilover, and he helped Wayne Spozanek in his Tropical Thunder. But the stuff that you talked about, Gary, in this book, people just think he was just an independent guy, just worry about Carolina Crusher. He was more to it than that.
Gary is one of those guys, and I know of a couple of them like this. He wanted you to believe that he's just one of those independent guys. He didn't need to prove. He didn't need to speak. He just let the truck do the talking. In other words, he would just kind of pretend he was just one of the guys building a truck, but behind that was a lot of knowledge and just wisdom. A lot of this was experimental. It just made sense to him, and his instincts were extremely good. And he was, he really flew under the radar. He deserves a lot more credit, I think, than what historically he's been given so far. Everybody knows him, but I don't know that everybody realizes how much innovation he did and how much he contributed to our sport. He wasn't just the person, and there's distinctions. We get into the Hall of Fame stuff. There's distinctions that can be made between different types of personalities that have made their way into the Hall of Fame and all, but Gary is one of those that fits kind of everything. He not only was a like that persona that you saw and in the TNT days on television and all, but behind the scenes, he had the technical savvy and wasn't afraid to experiment with and do things different than what everybody else was doing. So I think he deserves a lot of credit. I don't know that I gave him enough credit in the book, honestly.
Like you talked about that offset cradle that he had, the 4-link offset, which a lot of people always scratch their heads about and stuff like that. But you talked about how, Gary took that design of the offset cradle and or the 4-link bars. When I'm saying offset, a lot of people have, if you take a look at a cradle of a monster truck, the upper 4 links is hooked up, looks even. And then the bottom, well, on Gary's, I think Carolina Crusher 5, I think it's even further back. It's like one's shorter, one's closer to the other, and that was another feat that somehow, and if you looked at it, you're scratching your head on how it works, but it worked.
There was more technical theory data written originally that was taken out of the book because eventually the book was getting too big, and I decided maybe this is stuff that I need to set aside for a future book that's more on the theory side, right? The engineering theory behind some of the why certain things were done certain ways. But and I may have just touched on it. I didn't get into a lot of detail about it, but Gary did that for a very specific reason. He was trying to improve the instant center of the truck for traction. We were straight line drag racing at that time. Mm-hmm. And he recognized that the truck originally was set up differently. It had inboard. This was very early coilover truck, one of the very first. And the coilovers, his Custer coilovers, were mounted inboard of the frame on a very steep angle. And that's where the truck got the nickname Eileen, and because the truck always sat crooked, And mm-hmm. This was before sway bars, and then he incorporated a sway bar system into the rear cantilevers on the truck. It had leaf springs that spanned between the cantilever arms that acted as a torsion bar. And, again, guy's sharp. And he recognized that he didn't want to have when you, and this, I don't want to get too technical about in this.
I think fans don't care.
High instant center, and the link bars are steeper, you have more deflection. So when the truck takes an off camber landing, or the axles pivot more, right? It'll tend to steer the truck around. You want to try to have as minimal deflection as possible. Well, Gary recognized that way before most people did. And so he designed his cradle, he modified his cradle to where his front 4 links were set up for very minimal deflection, but his rear were set up for a lot of instant center to really cause the truck to bite. And, it was a compromise to allow the truck, because you still have to be able to keep it going in a straight line down the track, but he was using the setup on the rear to get him off the line.
And also in books, also give a shout out to Dan Patrick too, because you talked about all the way back when all the way back to Don Van Loo's Magnum Force, and the stories on pretty much people say that Don's truck was the first Patrick.
It was the first chassis. Patrick chassis.
Oh, okay, it's I don't know why I quotation that. It was his first Patrick chassis. It was just, the stories of what happened to that truck at Indy or Bloomsburg, and Dan basically redid that whole truck.
Right. I tell the story of how it came to be. Don Van Loo modified that, the truck before Bad Medicine before, and it was not drivable. And, and so he wanted it modified. I don't want to tell the whole story that's in the book.
Right.
He went to Dan, and of course Dan, had worked with Bigfoot and built, the chassis for 8, 9, and 12. And so that led to, Dan was like, no, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to, I'd be better off just building you something that's right. And So that became the first Patriot chassis.
Right. And the stories I told about this stuff, and let's go all the way back to let's go all the way forward to the last chapter, which you talked about in the beginning with the
My favorite.
with the Black Wino, but the chapter was called Genesis. And with that last chapter, what made you name that? Because like you said prior in this episode, that you talked about, the first chapter mixing with the last chapter, but you called the last chapter Genesis.
Right. The reason that I did, and again, I'm speaking for myself. There'll be different opinions on this, but for Scott and I agree on this point, and we said we'll go to the mat on defending it too. That was the first machine that crossed the threshold of what we would consider a monster truck, and we use different criteria because we like, what are the counter arguments, right? So we went through all these things, and we are convinced that it met. If you take what defined a monster truck at the time the term was coined or attached to what we know as a monster truck, right? Which a Bigfoot 1 was the first truck called a monster truck. First truck that meets the criteria of what we consider to be a monster was the term existed before, and I go into that of how far back that term existed in the book, but of what we would consider as defining what a monster truck was, this machine met all of and even, like I said, surpassed it, because it was more advanced than many of the early monster trucks, like quote monster trucks.
So how was
I would say that Samson was probably the first truck that matched a lot of the things that this thing was doing in 1964. And that was 1985.
Holy cow. So what?
Yeah, it was advanced.
So how did you get information about this vehicle, and what got you more in investigating about it?
Well, I was fascinated by it. I mean, it was known. There were I think 2 pictures of it on the internet out there. They were bad pictures of it. They were taken way after they were what the truck or the thing was originally like. These were after it had already been modified and all, so they weren't really accurate representations of what the thing really was, because the thing was a showpiece when it was in its prime. But I didn't know that at the time. But because these stories were out there, because there were like, what was the first truck on military axles and type? That was back in the old, what was it? Monster Mayhem forums. I don't know if you remember that far back.
Yeah.
It came up once or twice, and so in doing research about it, I tried tracking down some of the names referenced, and it took a long time. And friends of friends, and hey, yeah, call it. Are you familiar with this thing? And people, most of them aren't alive anymore. They don't remember, So I finally ran into somebody, and they go, "Yeah, I think I know this guy, and he owns a shop, and his son, or he's the son of one of the people involved." And so we went through this, connections, and eventually I was able to get a hold of one of the people involved, and he was wondering. I mean, obviously this happened so long ago. He was wondering why I was even asking, right? He was a little bit defensive at first, but as we got into it and I explained what I was attempting to do, he said, "Well, let me put you in contact with John and see if maybe he can help you a little bit and give you some more information." And we had quite a few conversations, and we got to be pretty good friends. I flew out and met with them, and we went to dinner and a couple of times, and and we still communicate. It's a fascinating story. It is absolutely the coolest thing, and to me, it's the best story in the book. I'm sorry, it might be offensive to some people, but to like, I can put myself in the time and what they did at that, what they did in the early 1960s would be almost unthinkable in the 80s. And these were high school kids, or, you know, some were in high school and some were just out of high school. And just the logic that they used, like, oh, we can use this to do this. It was like, that's the quintessential monster truck builder. Like, these don't exist, or we don't have the money to buy something, or they don't make it, right? But we have a need. What can we find that fills that need? And then, being kids with very little money, they had to scrounge for it and be very creative in how they came up with these parts and how they found them or acquired them, and the stories of these quests they would go on to find a certain thing that led to other amazing stories that, you know, fires and just crazy things, you know, the drama that occurred while they were building it, you know, using a tree in their backyard as a lift.
Shade Tree Mechanic.
Amazing. I mean, amazing. These guys, and then add to that, like, this thing was just phenomenal, right? I mean, it was just a work of art. And then these guys go on to, even after, and the story of why we don't, the general population doesn't know of this thing, is an amazing story in itself. And the world would be very different, or our industry would be very different if it were not for one thing, right, that happened. But the lives that these individuals involved went on to lead were amazing in their, you know, in their own right. Like, these guys were gifted, you know, and it's my favorite story. I've read it. I bet I've read that story 50 times between the writing it and everything, because it's just like, to me, it's like the feel good story of how we felt when we first started. Like, I can empathize with them. Like, I can put myself in that place and go, oh, how exciting it was to do something that had never been done before. And we don't get that now to that degree. And that's not being critical of the industry. It's for people that are critical about, oh, there's no innovation or anything. That's crap. But there is innovation. It's just different. And all industries go through this. All motorsports go through this. My phone is going to die if I don't plug it in here pretty soon. We may have to take a break, but the stories that these guys went on to lead, the lives, you know, and unfortunately, one of the individuals who went on to have an amazing life just recently passed away in an accident, breaking a world record. And I'm as sad as it is, I'm so happy that I was able to give him the recognition that he deserved for this accomplishment. And I think as more people read the book, I think it'll be recognized more. And I don't know if this is the last we've heard about it. In other words, I think there's a lot of story to tell there.
Now, a lot of people were commenting, a lot of the readers, I have to bring them up to make them happy, but they were mentioning about Master Disaster, Doug Spaniard, and all those guys. They created a lot of stuff that is also in this book. One of the first to have one of the first 4 links, also testing out coil springs.
It was the first coil. It wasn't the first 4-link, but it was the first coil trip, monster truck.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of gray area, you know. It depends on what you consider a monster truck. In terms of a monster truck, Blue Thunder was probably the first 4-link monster truck, but Doug was the first coil truck, and again, defined as a monster truck. There were there were other machines that had coils on them that were not monster trucks per se, but had attributes of what we would, of a monster truck.
Mhm. Right. And that brought us to attention also, like you said, that there's so many people adding parts back and forth to make a vehicle better on the evolution of the truck. And like I said before, we like kind of, I don't want to keep on bringing it up, but it's just cool how each has individual stories within a story that is a chapter within a chapter of the recognition that you're giving everyone in the industry and people that not even thinking, like you said, the last part of the story, those people didn't think that their technology maybe went to someone, or them with their technology knowing that some of the stuff that they put together would later on be in some of these awesome vehicles. You know what I mean? And just the patience that you had to make this book, detailed it with a fine-tooth comb, is spectacular in itself. And man, I'd like to thank you and Scott for this book, and what you guys have done, because there's like I said, there's so many chapters within a chapter. It's pretty cool.
Thank you. I mean, that the whole point of writing this was to give credit to those unsung heroes that I don't feel had gotten a fair shake, that their contributions hadn't been recognized. And I just wanted to make sure that it was documented for future fans.
Right. And if anyone's interested in getting this, where can they possibly?
It's only available one place. MonsterTruckTechnology.com.
A lot of people are wondering how to get that T-shirt too.
They're available on there too.
All right, there. Hey, folks, if you got that, there was a few questions saying, "Man, I'd like to get hands on that T-shirt," and that answers your question right there, guys. The website itself that Marty just talked about.
It's the Stages book. I mean, the Stages shirt. It's got the controversial 4 stages of monster trucks that for some reason there are deniers out there that don't believe that there's actually a 4th stage of monster truck.
I believe there is one. Those
are generally the people that have never built one. If you've built one or worked on one, you know that there's 4 stages.
A lot of people, there was a lot of comments here, good comments, awesome comments about it. A lot of people said they got the book in the electrical, I guess, like a iPad or Amazon type book. They got that digitally. I think that's the right call. Digital copy.
No, there's not an ebook version yet.
Ebook.
I was reluctant to do it because I didn't want all the images to make their way all over the internet, or I didn't want to make it easy for pictures of certain vehicles and things to get on the internet for a while. Like, there will be a version eventually. I've got somebody that will do an audio version for me. We've been talking about it. I figure a lot of us that spend a lot of time on the road, it's something interesting to listen to.
I think that'd be cool.
So there may be an audio version and an e-version available at some point.
Let me awesome to have.
Send messages if you're interested in such a thing.
Yeah, especially, still us guys hauling those monster trucks from 10 plus hour drives, that keeps us entertaining, and having David Lee narrate, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. I've got a guy that does really good voiceover stuff that he can do. We can awesome. I'm in no rush. If you want to continue this conversation, or you need to cut it short, but if we're going to continue, I better plug this thing in.
Oh no, yeah, I am pretty good. We are right now busting an hour and 10 minutes, and We may have to
And
do
we
another
barely
episode.
scratched the surface.
No, yes, we have barely scratched the surface. If not, we'd probably be doing a marathon, and then I'll be missing my ride back to the shop, and then I have to figure out how to get to New York, New Jersey. But I will love to have you on again and explain more detail about this, and hopefully people will order more about this book and also join in and talk about this, because I mean, there's so much to talk about. Like, I mean, we didn't even talk about the Mud Rat, and that truck's still
That's what I
around
was
today.
referring to earlier about that. Not technically a monster truck, but
Yeah.
it had 66s. It had coil springs. It was rear engine. It
Mhm.
had a lot of innovative things, but technically it wasn't a monster truck. Just depends on how you want to cut it,
Right. That's the detail, and also the story of Dale Hancock and the Crimson Crusher about how he used tractor tires instead of regular. You also explain about to help people out the difference between a spool and a locker inside of a third member. A lot of people may not know about that information. It's just you went all the way to stuff that like dated back to 3600 BC. That's it's so much to talk about, in detail.
How many people knew that planetaries date back to like 500 BC roughly?
Yeah,
you think it's something new? Like, no, they're not. They've been around a long time.
Right. And like you said, we just scratched the surface in this book, but if I could say about this episode, I guess we could talk about it as an intro and maybe getting into stuff like that. But there's so much more to talk about in this book that I gotta have you on, and we can maybe prior to discuss other stuff in the book and stuff like that. But folks,
anytime, I love talking about this stuff. So
yes, I know, and I love listening.
Too bad we can't do it together somewhere on the road. Maybe at some point that'll happen.
I mean, like Nick Davis even says, you can learn about ancient pottery in this book. That's the neat thing. And we like, for instance, I opened up and talked about, you even talked about the history of the center seat, date back, the talk about Mad Dog as one of the first, I think, the center truck.
Actually, again, Blue Thunder was the first
Thunder,
seat truck. But
right.
Again, you got Mud Rat, you got. It just depends on how you want to cut it. But related to the Blue Thunder thing, I think that's another big revelation in the book that I don't think people understand of how important Kevin Dabney and Kirk were
the Blue
in terms
Thunder
of innovation. Those guys did a lot of things, and like we touched on earlier, the Clark Planetary, which is probably one of the most, defining components of a monster truck, came about as a result of those guys.
Right. They're figuring out
a really strange accident that happened that resulted in something that now is,
they knew something they had.
Of the monster trucks,
Right. They knew something that they had, and they looked over and they said, we're going to put that thing can fit in this.
Yep.
Or fit on this.
I have two parts here. Whoa, wow, they go together.
And they created that,
Yep.
And it's just crazy to talk about, and once again, you go from, talk, you even went on detail talking about planetary spoiler guides. It's just crazy how, like I said before, like the detail of it. So, I would love to have you back on, and maybe we could do this not a yearly thing, but maybe have you on in a few months and make it like a quad, like 4 episodes in this monster truck technology book, and we can go more in depth and as Nick Davis says, one day Tim will look over and see Cheech and say that guy could fit in that race truck. Hope. But no, I would love to have more and more of that, because there was one time. This is, for instance, I even text messaged Tim.
Nick was helpful in this book as well.
Yes, to shout out to Nick. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff I always talked always text message Tim. Like, for instance, I know you talked about motors and engines. You talked about the Midget 540 and Richard Midget. People may not know started building Dennis's motors back in the early 90s, and Feld found out that how reliable his skills are keeping a motor alive. But you talked about the Hemis, you talk about the Hall Brothers Hemis, but you also talked about Jack Woolman in the twin cam V8. And I had a text message. I had a text message Tim about that because I wanted a little bit more in depth about how Jack went a different route for a lot of power. Because people,
that motor was designed to be the Hemi killer.
Yes,
but
yes.
It was well, I tell the story. It was banned. It would have, no telling what would have happened if it wasn't that people, flipped out over it and go, that's an unfair advantage, and you know how that goes. All of a sudden it gets banned, and it, so it didn't ever get its fair shake. But it was an amazing piece of, equipment, and it was cool that Jack, actually ran it, and I tell the story, and that was in a very abbreviated version of it. There's a lot more to the story, obviously, but it was just one facet of a several hundred other things that we had to talk about. So I could only dedicate so much time to it. But there's more information than you'll find anywhere else related, especially as related to monster trucks.
Right. That's when I had text message Tim to get if he knew a little bit more in depth, because he's to me, I pick his brain about motors all the time because I live in basically at the shop. I mean, and it's pretty cool that you also brought that story up to it in the book too about Mark and Tim, and having Brad Anderson, and basically you're saying in the book, which is pretty cool, that the motors kind of is similar to the NHRA drag racing engines that you would see on today's performance cars. Instead of a 565, they're 500, but they also have a 1471 compared to 871, and
right.
One's 10,000 horsepower, the other one's 2. But
right.
I mean, outside of that too, I mean, you like I said, I can't beat it. I can't mention it more of how much support that you gave shout outs to, and
there's only one technology. I won't say what it is, but there's only one significant technology that is not, it may be just referred to but not delved into in the book, only because we couldn't find any definitive, the development was really vague. There were lots of people experimenting with it, and there was no way to pin it down. So I said, I'm not even going to bring it up. If I can't be informative about it, then I don't really necessarily want to get into it. But other than that one thing, the book covers pretty much every facet of a monster truck, I would say, technologically. Anyway.
I guess what we could do maybe in the next couple episodes, if you want to, is go more in depth about each chapter, or maybe the chapters itself.
Surprise me.
Surprise you, yeah.
No, I said you surprised me with some questions.
Oh,
Let's see if I can come up with some answers off
right
off the top of my head.
Right, but still, I mean, once again, Marty, I have you in I'm a pencil in and closer in time and stuff like that. But man, a lot of love for you, Marty. A lot of people are enjoying this book.
I wish I was out there with you.
Yeah. Well, hopefully next year you can get everything will get settled in, and we'll see Overkill in the summer. Yeah, and see Overkill back. I guess they're doing some shows with Ed Beckley.
Yeah, we've got some stuff coming up.
Yeah. So
you might even see me behind the wheel at some point.
Yeah. Someone mentioned saying the last time they saw Overkill, you were behind the wheel in Arkansas or Alabama, one of those A states down south.
Yeah, we got some stuff planned.
Awesome. Well, Marty, any social media people can follow you at?
Monster Truck Technology. Facebook. Pretty much that's where everything. I don't, I'm not a promoter. I don't, in terms of promoting the book, I promoted it for a little while, and I just kind of let it stand on its own merit. I have a lot of additional data like for Christmas, I figured I'd give everybody a Christmas present and posted video of Black Rhino and Lunar Dooner, just a little clip, just to, whet people's appetite a little bit. But I have a lot of additional data that I wanted to put out there to help keep the ball rolling. But we'll see. We'll see as time allows. I'll maybe start posting some more stuff.
Man, that's awesome. Once again, guys. Once again, Marty, I'll have to have you on, but thank you for joining, and thank you for this awesome conversation about this book.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Anytime.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Marty. Thank you again.
All right. Take care.